I'm Angela Torres. I'm the Senior Manager of Local Planning Assistance at the Metropolitan Council in the Community Development Division. My team works with communities all across the region to provide direct technical support to local governments as they're working on their comprehensive plans. We're here to talk about some of that today. We also do policy development for land use as well as a few other areas of the Regional Development Guide. I'm here today with Mackenzie Young-Walters, who is a senior planner in local planning assistance. He'll be doing the bulk of the presentation and talking through some of the more technical land use review items that we have on the docket for today. Like Anya mentioned, this is the fourth webinar in our four-part series. I've been talking with Patty, though, and as communities identify additional needs and as there's interest for other partnership topics between Metro Cities and the Metropolitan Council, we're happy to come back in and develop more programming for the region. So with that, we thought we would start with a little bit of an icebreaker. So I hope everyone would join me in opening up the chat and just take a quick second to think about one benefit of doing good land use planning. Why do we do land use planning in the region? You can go ahead and put the answers in the chat, and if I can see those, I will read a few off as they're coming in. A better future, keeping harmful pollutants away from residential areas, environmental reasons, absolutely. When opportunities arise, the agencies are ready to capitalize on them. Exactly, resilience and readiness. Resource and infrastructure management, absolutely, that's a great one. Convenient access to work, housing, and play, all kinds of things there, yep. Preserving natural resources, coordinated growth, happiness, and opportunities. Yep, livability is one of the highlights of our region. Planned and orderly growth coming through as well. A lot of really great answers. A lot of really great reasons why we do what we do, right? Feel free to continue adding on. Give people maybe a few more. Data-informed analysis of built environment as social determinants of health. Again, and a lot of really great environmental reasons as to why we do good land use planning. Great. So, okay, let's go to the next slide, Mackenzie. We'll talk a little bit about what we're going to be doing today. So while it's good to ground ourselves in why this work is important, today will be a lot more focused on the structural requirements of land use plans. That's an important part of what we do as well. We'll start by framing the conversation as a brief reminder of what a land use plan is, some of the main minimum requirements for 2050. It's important to just know those things. We'll talk a little bit about why the council has those requirements, how they tie into our systems and responsibilities, before pivoting to a discussion on the relationship of land use and zoning. Just briefly, they are tied very closely together, although the Metropolitan Council, to be clear, does not do zoning. Finally, we'll go into detail on the role the land use plans have in the review of the decennial comprehensive plan updates, as well as amendments, MUSA staging and expansion requests, and sewer extension permits as well. This conversation will include a discussion of the 2026 MUSA implementation guidelines, as well as some examples to help clarify how those guidelines are applied. Sorry, I had a tickle. Thank you for your patience. We're going to dig into land use and comprehensive plans. Going back to our icebreaker, there's a lot of reasons as to why we do land use planning, and of course, orderly and economical growth of the region is a part of that. The council sets a regional direction with overarching objectives, high-level objectives. The regional land use objectives address more specifically what you've got here, but just quickly: growth management, transportation, community design and well-being, natural systems, housing, equitable development, climate change, and economic well-being. We have a lot of tools that we use on how we implement those land use objectives. We've talked about some of those concepts in our previous webinars, things like community designations, forecasted growth, minimum density expectations, which we'll talk about today, as well as accommodating affordable housing, where applicable, the transit station area density expectations. We also do staging development by decade, and the Metropolitan Urban Service Area, or the MUSA, by decade, which helps us plan for our infrastructure investments. Next slide, please. Each of the objectives that I just mentioned are implemented by a suite of policies and actions. The policies seek to ensure that land develops in a way that supports our regional systems and advances regional goals. They establish a broad framework that local governments then incorporate in a way that reflects local vision, local values, and knowledge into the comprehensive plan's land use plan. As an example, this is one of the policies in the Imagine 2050 land use chapter. The policy here states that growth will be accommodated efficiently and cost effectively. Below that, I've summarized the actions that are that are tied to that policy. Sometimes it's through something the council will encourage, like compact development. Other actions include local requirements like minimum density expectations and meeting affordable housing need. Not all policies will apply to every community too. So if you're not a community that's within the MUSA, or a community with a possible expansion through orderly annexation agreements, those policies wouldn't apply to you. We'll talk about how you know which ones apply to you when we get into some of our tools and resources. Well, we did talk at our last webinar as well about tools and resources, and the checklist for minimum requirements is one of those things. Next slide, please. So then what is a land use plan? We have land use policies and objectives, the regional policy, but what is a land use plan? Well, if you're reading the statute, looks like a land use plan is kind of a catch-all category of the comprehensive plan. After all, everything relates to land use. Full disclosure, both Mackenzie and I have a land use planner background, so there's a little bias there. Land use is a foundation for all of our planning work. So for the purposes of today's session, we're not going to discuss most of these though of course the council has minimum requirements ensuring that plans incorporate all of the legally required elements. In practice, some of these elements like housing and greenhouse gas emissions and water end up kind of meriting their own chapters. Local governments can determine how they structure their plans. But rather than trying to cover everything today, we're going to focus in on what most of us planners think about when we hear the phrase land use plan, which is number 2, designates location, extent, and intensity of use of land and water for various purposes. So when we hear land use plan, we're thinking about the portion of the comprehensive plan that lists and describes land use categories, the maps that show the location of those categories, and the staging plan that shows up when these areas will develop. If we go back to our statutory basis, it reflects the requirement to designate the existing and proposed location, extent, and intensity of the use of land and water for a variety of purposes. Statute specifically calls out agricultural, residential, commercial, industrial, and other public and private purposes, or any combination of such purposes. So let's get into the minimum requirements. I'm going to turn it over to Mackenzie to take the rest of the presentation. Mackenzie, if you want to further introduce yourself, that would be great as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Angela. So I'm Mackenzie Young Walters. I'm a sector representative with the Metropolitan Council. I work with communities in Scott and Carver County. One of the reasons why I'm helping with this presentation is I also helped with the update of the MUSE implementation guidelines, which will make up a big part of the second half of this presentation. So kind of circling back to our icebreaker, right? There's a lot of really organic, natural, important reasons why we do land use planning, but ultimately the structure of your land use plan does reflect the council's minimum requirements because there are things that need to be addressed. When we're looking at this cycle's land use plan, many of these requirements have not changed significantly since the Thrive 2040 plan, but we did make some big changes. One of the biggest ones is we updated the density requirements for all of the communities in the urban service area. Um, and along with that, we added a requirement that communities plan to meet those density requirements by decade. In the 2040 cycle, the requirement had been that the density requirements had to be met for by averaging the development throughout the entire planning period. Now we're asking that each decade hit that target. Another big change is requiring that any residential district that allows a detached single family housing include another product type as well. It's up to the communities what product type that is. It could be an accessory dwelling unit, could be twin homes, attached single family. And I do want to just take a second to clarify, land use and zoning are not the same. This requirement does not mean that a city cannot have exclusively single family zoning. It just is asking that the land use category have a broad enough density range and list enough product types that something besides single family could be included without requiring a comp plan amendment. The other major change regarding to how the density is calculated is that rather than Thrive 2040, where we asked cities to identify the areas that were changing between the 2030 and 2040 plan, we're asking cities to include all of the areas that will be accommodating growth in the 2050 plan into the density calculations. We've also added minimum requirements that are tied to examining MUSE expansion requests through the lens of ensuring that there's a 20 rolling year land supply, rather than just whether or not there's theoretically capacity within the municipal system. With that, I'm going to spend a little bit of time going through what the main minimum requirements are. This will not be an exhaustive discussion, but I'm going to touch on the highlights. So I like to think of the minimum requirements as kind of falling into clusters. And that first cluster is setting the stage for the future content of the plan. So we ask that communities acknowledge their community designation. As you saw in the previous slide, that community designation determines things like applicable density policy, but it also determines many of the other Metropolitan Council policies that apply to a community. And we also ask that the community in this section acknowledge its forecasted growth and its obligation to plan to accommodate that growth. And that's really the heart of land use planning is accommodating anticipated growth in a way that's going to allow for the efficient and economical development of the region. This section also asks me to describe what's currently present. So that includes an existing land use map showing where the existing land uses are, and then a table saying the acreage of that land use and where it's present in the community. Once this, oops, I hit twice. Once the stage has been set, that's when the actual planning gets to begin. And the first stage of actually setting up the actual planning portion for the future land use is describing the land use categories. The expectation is not that there's a description of land use categories that's comparable to the level of detail present in a zoning code. It's designed to be a high level description, noting the density range and the general type of development that's expected. So something like low density residential, 2 to 5 units an acre, accommodating detached single family and twin homes with typical neighborhood amenities. And the purpose of this district is to accommodate traditional low density residential development would be, a perfectly fine description for a land use category. There's no need to go into the, um, you know, conditional uses, permitted uses, accessory uses like you have in the zoning code. In fact, we'd encourage you not to get in that level of detail because then anytime you amend your zoning code, you would need to amend your comprehensive plan to reconcile those two. I will also say that just like the land use categories shouldn't have the same level of detail as your zoning code. Generally, it's a best practice not to have your land use categories be a one-to-one ratio with your zoning code, where each zoning district has its own land use category. The reason for that is land use is intended to be more general, and you want to give yourself flexibility so that every rezoning doesn't entail a comprehensive plan amendment. Once your land use categories are set up, then they're assigned to the different locations in the city using the future land use map. And then the acreage from those locations and the areas that have been identified as where future development and redevelopment is going to occur are used to populate a future land use table. The table does, as we mentioned earlier, need to be broken down by decade. And within each decade, the minimum density by acres needs to meet the community designations requirement for the target density to be developed during the planning period. So that's decade staging in the table is what informs then the staging map and the staging plan that's present in your comprehensive plan. And the staging plan really is meant to be the best guess the city has for what's going to develop and when it will develop. When cities are expanding, it also shows when they believe urban services will become available and to new portions of the city. And that's where, if we like look at the map in our example, you can see there's the dark blue, that's the areas that are currently being served. And then the city in this example has shown, where it's going to expand its MUSA in the 2020 decade, 2030 decade, 2040, and which areas are being reserved for development outside of the plan horizon. Doing it this way ensures that both the local infrastructure is going to be available to support the planned development, and also that our regional infrastructure is going to be in place to accommodate as much growth as is planned to come in during each decadal staging period throughout the region. Um, we require that cities use the land that's in their control to meet any element of their land use plan that's meeting regional policy. So density minimums, staging plans, things like that. What that means in practice is that land either needs to be within municipal boundaries or subject to an orderly annexation agreement if it's being used to accommodate forecasted growth and to meet those policy needs that we talked about. That's really at its crux, the heart of what a land use plan is. There are a lot more minimum requirements, but those are the ones that really shape the flow of the plan. So it's fair to ask, why are we requiring cities to provide us all this information? What do we do with it? The goal of all of these requirements, all of this request for information to be in the land use plan, is to support the council's goal of creating orderly and economical growth. One of the ways we do this is by ensuring there's a balanced land supply, that enough land is available to support growth while not having so much land available that we're encouraging sprawl and the premature extension of municipal services. Um, we also just need to know the location and intensity of proposed land uses to make sure that our regional systems have adequate capacity and that we're making the investments we need to support that growth. We also need this information to make sure that the investments we're making in our regional systems are, one, made at the appropriate time, that they're not premature and that they're not late, and also that they're being fully utilized and that the fees generated by them are paying for the cost of the infrastructure. The information that's provided to us in the future land use plan and the staging table helps inform council decision making, and it helps us to verify that plans are conforming and consistent with our system plans and policies. So, how exactly do your local plans inform our plans? We don't make our plans in a vacuum. And while land use plans are not the only thing we look at, they really do play a big part in how we make decisions about our investments. Just like how our regional investments play a big part in how you make your land use decisions. We incorporate the information in future land use plans into forecasting models. We obviously assign more growth to areas and sections of a city that are guided to have density residential than we do to ones that are guided to be entirely low density residential. Future land use plan is also one of the data points we use in evaluating the land within the MUSA to determine whether or not we have a rolling 20-year land supply. We look at how much growth we're projecting, how much that growth is scheduled to be absorbed based on your plans in each decadal cycle, and we determine whether or not there's sufficient land within the MUSA to accommodate that growth. And we time the investments in wastewater, as I mentioned in the last slide, based on the staging you give us for when and where that growth will occur. When the Metropolitan Council authorizes a comprehensive plan, we are committing to provide services at the levels that are shown in that plan. So if 1,000 acres are planning to come online in a city in 2040, we're making investments to make sure that we have appropriate lift station, pipe size, and other infrastructure to actually serve those developments in the time plan. We also look at where communities are clustering businesses and people when we make decisions around transit, transportation, access to regional parks. And the reason that we can place so much importance on the land use plan is because, well, cities implement the land use plans, the state law requires that their zoning and official controls are consistent with the information that's provided in the comprehensive plan. The state law also requires that no official controls are adopted that conflict with the comprehensive plan. So, because there's a legal framework that ensures that the minimums established by the comprehensive plan in terms of things like density will be what's actually built, we can have a high confidence making investments based on cities' land use plans because we know that that is what is actually going to be approved. I stole the Pyramid of Discretion from the League of Minnesota Cities. I'm sure a lot of you recognize it. It's one of the first things my boss gave me when I was hired as a planner about 10 years ago. And I think it does a really good job of outlining the role that the comprehensive plan plays in advising zoning and subdivision decisions. I do think maybe it could be, for the purposes of this conversation, improved a little bit by having another base layer below, which is the regional development guide. Because just like how your comprehensive plan can establish the limits of what can be approved through the zoning and subdivision ordinance, the regional development guide and the regional system plans in some ways establish the boundaries, right, through the minimum requirements that your comprehensive plans have to fall within or at the very least address. Obviously, you have a great deal of freedom in how you structure your comprehensive plans and can include many things that go well above and beyond the minimum requirements. But, an example would be if our sewer system plan only has capacity for 1,000 units within a sewer shed, you can't have a comprehensive plan that's going to have 2,000 units there. It simply can't be served in a consistent manner with regional policy. So, circling back to the role of the comprehensive plan with regards to zoning, the city, has a ton of discretion in how they set up the land use categories, right? There's nothing that says your low density residential has to be 2 to 5 units or 2 to 10 units. The city can set up whatever box, for lack of a better word, it wants for that land use category. But once that box is established, the law requires that any zoning that's passed, say the 2 to 5 unit per acre is selected, has to fall within that 2 to 5 acre range. Even if the zoning code theoretically could allow, say, 2 to 10 units an acre, the law requires that only things that fall within that 2 to 5 unit per acre can be approved because that's what's consistent with the land use plan the city established, and then that the council authorized as consistent with our policy. So again, we do not directly implement the city's land use plan by any means. What all our role is to create the policy that establishes a framework that your comprehensive plan then works within. And our review is, with regards to the comprehensive plan updates and amendments, is really focused on ensuring that those plans are consistent and conform with the regional systems and regional plans. The other reason why we can put such faith in this document is because any change to the land use plan will require a comprehensive plan amendment, which gives us an opportunity to review the change for any potential impacts to our systems and policies. And then we also have another chance to conduct a review when things intersect directly with our regional systems. For instance, in the case of sewer extension permits, where our role is to verify that the connection request is consistent with the local government's comprehensive plan. So now that we've talked a little bit about those reviews, let's go into some detail on how the reviews are conducted. So I went over the abridged list of minimum requirements earlier, but really the minimum requirements checklist is what we're reviewing comprehensive plan updates and amendments against. One of the things we've done this cycle is through the local planning handbook. You can access your individualized checklist of minimum requirements. We also sent them out, and we have a Power BI table in there that has links to fact sheets and resources linked to, I think virtually every minimum requirement has an associated resource, and we're bringing more online all the time. Philosophically, we really want to make sure that when we've established a requirement, it's clear to you what we're asking, why we're asking it, and also that if it's data we can provide, we're providing it to help you address it, as easily as possible. Staff also uses this checklist, as I mentioned, as the basis for our reviews. When we receive the comprehensive plan updates and comprehensive plan amendments, we go through the checklist and make sure that it is touching on and conforming with all of the policy points that are relevant to that community. We are actively and continually working to ensure that within the Metropolitan Council, we have the exact same understanding of these requirements so that you're getting consistent feedback from us. One of the tools we're doing to use that is we actually this year are doing a small communities planning program where we're going to be working with some of the smallest cities in the metro area to write their comp plans for them. As a practice exercise, myself and some other planners are writing some, uh, we'll call them draft comp plans, and we're going to run these through our review cycle to make sure that everyone is on the same page and is looking at and evaluating these plans the same way. The idea is if myself, a land use planner working for the Metropolitan Council who wrote some of the minimum requirements and wrote the implementation guidelines, right, is having trouble correctly meeting the minimum requirement, then we need to make sure that that is corrected and that you all are getting really clear direction from us so that we don't find this out in December of 2028 when we're trying to review the comp plans in reality. So the other resource we have with regards to this minimum requirements and helping with the reviews is we do have sector representatives. Sector representatives are your point of contact with the Met Council. They can provide individual responses and assistance, help clarify requirements, put you in contact with staff that can talk with you about them if it happens to be something more specific like transportation or housing. When it comes to comprehensive plan amendments, we're always happy to do a preliminary review, talk through implications, and give you a heads up on the process. In addition to that minimum requirements checklist, which we use to determine the policy consistency, we also have MUSA implementation guidelines, which flesh out how we implement our policies that relate to the MUSA. The intention of these guidelines is to ensure that there's a fair, transparent, and consistent process for reviewing all of these requests and that everything is being implemented in a consistent manner. So these guidelines cover a lot of territory. They dictate how density is calculated, how we review any request for expansion to the MUSA, and also how we review sewer extension permits to verify consistency with comprehensive plans. The council's had MUSA implementation guidelines in effect since 2004. Typically, they get updated every 10 years along with right after the redevelopment guide. We do sometimes make some mid-cycle tweaks if things are cropping up, but in general, major updates happen decadally. When we look at the changes we made from the last cycle, I'll go into a lot more detail in these in future slides, but just kind of bullet points. We've added some additional flexibility and exemptions when it comes to how we calculate net residential density. We've made efforts to align the level of review we use for sewer extension permits to be closer to the level of review municipalities use. Specifically, we now use preliminary plat approval as the basis for the density calculations rather than the final plat phase. So that helped prevent some disconnects that we noticed had popped up. We also fleshed out Imagine 2050's policy language with ways to implement the discussion on the need for to demonstrate that the 20-year rolling land supply was the impetus for MUSA expansions. And we'll talk more about that later. We also updated the plat monitoring program. So the plat monitoring program, just very briefly, is a program for communities in the suburban edge, which lets them get credit for approving plats above the minimum density towards their planned overall density. And we altered that program to better reflect the way cities were currently developing and to give them more credit for the good work that we'd observed was being done. And we'll go into a little more depth on that later too. These guidelines also combined a lot of other policies into a single location. So rather than having internal facing standard operating procedures, for example, for the sewer extension reviews, we incorporated them directly into the MUSE implementation guidelines so that it'd be easy for cities to access, look at, review, and understand exactly how we're looking at these things and applying our consistency checks. Um, the intention of all of this is to really standardize our review process and the point of our review process is to make sure that we're preventing any underutilization of the system through development not having enough units, and also to make sure we're not permitting the overutilization where we're simply running out of capacity because things are being built over what our understanding had been. These guidelines help us and reviews help us make timely and efficient investments into the system. The big goal is keeping land in what I call the Goldilocks zone, right? Not too hot, not too cold. We need to make sure that there's enough land eligible for urban services, that we're not artificially pushing up land prices, but we also want to make sure that there's not so much land that we're seeing leapfrog developments or premature development and pressure on rural lands where they're being moved from agriculture and other uses to housing when maybe that isn't justified. So we also included things in these guidelines that advance other regional policies. An example of that is the treatment of conservation easements, and that aligns with goals we have on supporting, conserving and protecting natural resources. So with that big overview of what the guidelines are, let's jump into the meat and potatoes of it. The first thing the guidelines do is define what's even meant by consistency. And essentially, for a community to be consistent with the council's density policy, it needs to plan to grow at or above the minimum overall net residential density for its community designation. And to calculate that, the guidelines specify that we use the minimum density for each land use identified as developing to accommodate forecasted growth during that staging period. That's averaged out citywide. So if we look at our examples here, you'll see that there are things that we'll pretend that fake Cityville over here is a suburban edge community. Density is required density is 3.5 units per acre overall. But you'll see there's multiple land use categories that are below that three. That's not an issue because at a citywide level within this decade, they're averaged out by the higher density land uses the city's expecting to develop. The reason why we used a minimum is because, as we talked about earlier, under state law, this it can't developments that are below the minimum density cannot be approved. So by using the minimum, we guarantee that even in the worst case scenario, we're not risking an underutilization of the regional wastewater system. There'll be enough units to make us whole on our investments and what we've invested in capacity. Now, we do recognize that most plats aren't actually approved at the barest minimum possible. And that's one of the things that the plat monitoring program was designed to address. So a little bit more on this from our previous, but originally the program had used well, the last 20-ish years of a city's development history, basically as long as it had been in the program, and the program had been started in 2001. But the problem was that because that included such a vast amount of data and so many acres, including acres that were done under prior comp plans, sometimes the 2020 comp plan, 2030 comp plan, it had a lot of low density residential development on the books. And that meant a lot of cities actually couldn't use this program to move their density up and get the credit that they deserved when we looked at how they'd really been pivoting to much higher density developments under the 2040 comp plan. So the guidelines changed the program from being a full program history to being the last decade of development. And this, we think, is going to give cities a lot more flexibility going forward, especially as it will be aligning the decade density calculation in the table with a decade of past development activity. So again, if we go back to our example table, we'll see that if we use just the minimum of the land uses, the city actually falls short of its 3.5. It's at 3.43. But in our fictional example, it's a plat monitoring community. It's been doing good work, platting well above its minimums. And so once we add in that program credit, it actually moves the city to 3.61, and it would be consistent with council policy. So, in order to make all of this work, we also need standardized definitions and a shared understanding. So, the next thing the MUSA implementation guidelines do is they define what the Metropolitan Council means by net density and how we calculate it. Many of these are carries overs from the previous implementation guidelines. However, there are some changes. So the exemption of areas that are protected from development by state and local ordinance, that's the steep slopes and whatnot, that's brought forward. There's no change there. We did add areas with insufficient depth to bedrock and water table, recognizing that areas where it's infeasible to develop due to geology and other factors shouldn't be held against the density calculations. We did expand what type of storm water ponds can be netted out from the calculations. Previously, the stormwater ponds had to be on a city-owned outlot. Now the requirement is just that they are publicly owned and maintained. So publicly owned and maintained storm easement for the pond would also allow it to be netted out. The parks and open spaces net out provision is carried forward. Previously, we only allowed arterial right-of-way to be netted out. However, after talking with cities and talking with our folks in transportation, it was determined that really the collector right-of-way network also has that regional benefit and that it would be appropriate to include that in the areas that can be netted out as well. So that's a pretty significant expansion from the last guidelines. We've also recognized that other elements of infrastructure that serve the community as a whole or a region, like, our sewer interceptors, gas pipelines, high voltage transmission easements, and things like that, can be netted out. And then we've recognized that publicly held conservation and preservation easements advance a lot of our natural resources systems goals, and it's appropriate to allow them to be netted out in advancement of that policy. Philosophically, we really looked at things that served more than just the immediate development, either a community or regional need, and that were under public ownership. Everything that's under private ownership is controlled by an HOA, does need to be included in density calculations. Um, I would also like to note, we understand that when you're making the future plan, a lot of these more granular things are not going to be known. The expectation is the future land use plan calls out what is known and that these granular things are going to be removed during development review and will be removed from calculations, when we're reviewing sewer extension permits, plat monitoring data, and other stuff where that more granular level is appropriate and known. So an example of how these are applied is the image on the right. This is a development that occurred on a little over 21 acres. 13 units were proposed, so that puts it at right around 0.6 units per acre. However, when we look at what can be netted out, this development has wetlands, wetland buffers. The city owns and maintains the stormwater ponds. The city, the outlot was deeded to the city, so it's city-owned open space around those wetlands. So once all of those exemptions are netted out, there's 4.4 net acres, which puts this development at 2.95 units per acre. So the netting out really does impact the calculations. In addition to defining how things are netted out, the update included a defined process for how we were going to apply Imagine 2050's language around use expansion reviews. The first criteria is just a continuation of the requirement that we always have, which is that the expansion is not going to create a policy inconsistency. So the amount of acreage and the minimum density for those acreage that's being added can't bring the community below its minimum density expectations. We do have a clarification that if a preliminary plat's available, we'll use that to do the density calculations to make sure, we're getting the numbers as accurate as possible. If it's not at a point where there's a preliminary plat, then we would just use the general future land use map and, the stuff that's known based on the best available information. We also require that in order for a community to have a use expansion, that they need to have met any previous conditions of approval for their comprehensive plan or comprehensive plan amendments. An example would be that if we'd approved a plan under the condition that, say, amended surface water management plan be submitted because the watershed hadn't approved it or something, we'd require that resubmittal happen prior to okaying a use expansion. The goal of this criteria to do the land use analysis was never to create barriers for an in-process real development, but to have a higher level of review for more speculative additions to the MUSA. So if a city comes to us and says, hey, we'd like to add 1,000 acres to the north to the MUSA, we really think that area is ripe for development. We're going to want to, the requirement is that we would look at the land supply. We'd use the future land use plan that exists, building permit data, plat monitoring data if available, maybe a city housing study, everything that was relevant to the conversation to determine whether or not the city's current MUSA provided that 20-year land supply given anticipated growth and observed rates of growth. If the city is demonstrating that it's potentially exceeding those forecasts and that land is needed to accommodate that growth and maintain that rolling land supply, no issue, would be approved. If there was some disagreement on that, the city could propose removing land from other portions of the MUSA so that there's no net change. If they've realized the north is just developing a lot faster than the south, for example. And it's possible there might be other information that would come to light that would let us enter into an agreement to authorize that expansion as well. But the goal is to make sure that the review is more than just, could we theoretically handle the capacity? It's, does this area need to develop, and is this the most efficient use and timely use of land? We also have some criteria that acknowledge some of the oddities that orderly annexation agreements can create. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this because it gets really deep in the weeds, but orderly annexation agreements don't expire or be renewed or renegotiated nicely on a decadal cycle. So sometimes if something expires mid-cycle or is renegotiated mid-cycle, it can cause a discrepancy between the OAA boundary and the MUSA boundary, or what was, initially forecasted to be in a city, but now suddenly the city's lost control of because the agreement lapsed mid-cycle. So we just created some policy ways to make it easier for cities to move forward in those situations. An example of how this review occurs is presented on the right. In this case, there's a 40-acre property that was not previously anticipated for development. It wasn't in the MUSA. So the city applied for a MUSA expansion. They let us know that they were planning to have it come in as low density residential, 2.5 to 3.9 acres. We added it to the density table like you saw a couple slides ago. It met the minimum density thresholds for the policy. And because this was a known associated with a known development, that ended the review. There wasn't a need to do a 20-year rolling land supply because, again, the intention of these guidelines was not to make it harder for a known development to move forward. Following this development to its next step, after the comprehensive plan was amended, The city, of course, moved forward with all the approvals, and we got a sewer extension permit for the development. And that's the final element of the guidelines is how these are reviewed. So when cities apply for a sewer extension permit with the MPCA, the council's asked to review that and assert whether or not it's consistent with the comprehensive plan. We use a two-pronged test to do that. First is, does the density fall within the established range for the land use category? And that's applied for each individual land use category. We don't average it out between different land use categories. So if a development has three land use categories, each sub area would need to fall within the respective range. And then we also do that check for product type. So if it's for a land use category that allows single family and twin homes, does the development contain single family and twin homes? Either single family or twin homes. Um, we use either the final plat if it's a single phase project or the preliminary plat for multi-phase projects to do the density calculation. And we also have some provisions allowing a little extra flexibility in cases where previously built property is being redeveloped. Just because we recognize in those cases, right, it's a little harder to determine the placement of local roads when they've already been built and you're working around that existing street grid. This section on sewer extension permits was a codification of the existing sewer review policy that existed before we adopted the 2026 guidelines. What we did was we moved our kind of internally facing process document and incorporated it into the publicly facing guidelines just for increased transparency and clarity. The only major change in this was that instead of only using the final plat, we aligned our review to be with the preliminary plat level, which is where cities conduct their density analysis. Our example would be, so following our example through, that 40-acre parcel came in with 48 units on it. By gross density, that'd be 1.28 units an acre, which would be short of the required 2.5. But because in this case there's 18 acres of wetlands and buffers, which the city had placed under conservation easements, it netted out to be 2.6 units per acre, which fell within the range. Sewer extension permit was approved, and the Met Council will never look at this development again. That's our review process, the comprehensive plan amendment through the sewer extension permit. So now that we've talked a little bit about how the council looks at these things, I'd like to just touch on some best practices, things to keep in mind as you look at your land use plan, and quite frankly, ways you can do less comprehensive plan amendments. The 2050 comprehensive plan update provides an opportunity for cities to really look at the land use plan and make sure it's still meeting your need. Make sure it's still aligned with the type of developments you're seeing and the type of developments you're approving. If your land use plan is well aligned with the zoning you're using and approving, there'll be less need for amendments, and I think that makes everyone happier. So some tips would be land use categories spanning multiple zoning districts. As we mentioned, having that many to one ratio so that every time there's a zoning change, it doesn't trigger a comprehensive plan amendment. And the other thing is if PUDs are being used and oftentimes for neighborhood styles that don't match the zoning, because it has a blend of housing types and it's a good mix of like smaller lots and like, for instance, attached single family housing. If you notice you're approving a lot of those, it might make sense to have a land use category designed to accommodate those type of neighborhoods that you like to see with the broad density ranges, allowing a bigger mixture of housing products than maybe your traditional zoning would allow, and then assigning that land use category to those areas that you think are really well suited to those blended neighborhoods. I think also there's in some cities maybe a misconception that the land use categories can't overlap. That it needs to be low density is 1 to 4, medium density is 4.1 to 5, or whatever the number may be. Um, that's not a council policy by any means. And I think it's usually a good idea to have some overlap, especially between like that low and medium density range. It gives you a lot more flexibility in improving developments, right? If you have that overlap and a little bit broader category, suddenly if a single family development is including some twin homes, it's not going to require a comprehensive plan amendment. Or if in a medium density development that's mostly townhomes has an area where they want some detached single family homes because it's a higher amenity location, going a little lower isn't going to create that need for a comprehensive plan amendment. Um, I think what we've observed is a lot of times when the land use matches the parcel, it's a lot more intuitive when a comprehensive plan amendment is needed. When single parcels have multiple land uses, just naturally, developments don't follow the nice grid maybe that was laid out. It's impossible to know exactly how much high density, medium density, and low density is going to go there. It almost always ends up triggering a comprehensive plan amendment. That can be dealt with either by just knowing that, being upfront with the developer and building that into the review timeline, or using wider land ranges that allow for that kind of flexible buffer where having twin homes or single family in this area isn't going to push it outside of the land use range. The last thing I have on this is, while it's good to call out, neighborhood amenities like maybe a neighborhood park that the city wants to see in an area, if it's put in the land use plan at a specific geographic location and being 4 acres, then when the development happens and the developer wants the park to be in the east instead of the west, it triggers that need for the land use plan amendment. And if you do something like more of a overlay where you say like this general area is our, neighborhood park search area and we envision putting a park somewhere in this broader area, then you've covered yourself. You've signaled to the developer, then to your community that this is definitely where the community wants a park, but you're not tying yourself to that specific location that's then going to trigger the land use amendment. So I think things like that to keep in mind can really help reduce the number of comprehensive plan amendments, especially the number of small comprehensive plan amendments that cities need to do. I think the worst case for everyone, quite honestly, is when a sewer extension permit is flagged for consistency issue. Um, I think one of the best ways to avoid that being caught late is just reaching out and talking to your sector representatives early. We have a link here to the map, but we're always happy to provide advisories. We're always happy to glance at density calculations, make sure that council numbers match your numbers. We're happy to advise on, ways a CPA could be structured, timelines, all of that. Generally, the need for a CPA, a comprehensive plan amendment, is identified early. It's not going to actually impact the development timeline, and it won't require much additional staff work because most of that material is going to be covered in your staff report anyways. It's when they're identified late in the process that it becomes really problematic for the development timeline and creates tension. I think a good rule of thumb is if a development is crossing multiple land uses, it's a good idea to just do a quick check and see whether or not that change is going to trigger a comprehensive plan amendment. We do have a couple examples. I know I'm getting really close to time on that, and I apologize for that. But that kind of illustrate how we do these calculations. This is an example of a development that was guided for low density residential, 3 to 6 units per acre. That district allowed for detached and attached single family. What the council received initially was this area in red because that was the final plat that was associated with the sewer extension permit. The net density on that actually is in the mid twos. It's below the minimum of 3, which caused us to flag this as a potential problem. When we requested the preliminary plat, when we looked at that, we realized that there wasn't in fact an issue because the preliminary plat in its whole is above 3 units an acre. What had happened here was, the stormwater pond and infrastructure that serves the entire development is of course in the first phase. And it happened that all of the stuff that can be netted out, the walking trails, the open space, the wetlands were in the second phase. And so we aligned our level of review with the cities, which was at the preliminary plat where they had done their check. And this was, of course, consistent with council policy. An example of where an inconsistency occurred is found here. In this case, there's an area that's guided for low density residential, 1.2 to 4 units an acre, area for medium 4 to 8, and an area for mixed use at 8 to 16. The low density only permits single family, and the medium density is townhomes and low density apartments. High density, the mixed use is apartments and condos. What was approved was a townhome development at 7.4 units per acre. So the issue with consistency when we do our consistency check on this one is that we have townhomes being built at 7.6 units per acre in an area that the comprehensive plan said would have a maximum of 4 units per acre. So there were 39, 40 units there instead of the plan 20. And then we also had the area to the south, which was guided for a minimum of 8 units an acre, coming in at that mid sevens, so below the minimum allowed by the comprehensive plan. This creates a potential policy inconsistency on our end because land of over 8 units an acre is used to meet the affordable housing need allocation, right? So by not doing the amendment to take that off of the land that's being used to meet that requirement, we can't evaluate whether or not the city remains consistent with the council's policy that it has sufficient land guided at 8 units an acre or higher to accommodate affordable housing. In this case, another issue that would be more of a city issue but could have council implications is the southern portion was platted as an outlot, but it's still left with the mixed use land use. That means that if the developer decided to if someone bought it, developer decides to request that it be rezoned to align with its land use, as state law says it should be, it would, in theory, have to be re-guided to have apartments, which would then result in more units being in this area than the comprehensive plan had called for, which could be a potential overutilization of the regional system. So that's why we do that two-part check. It's why we don't allow the density to move between the land uses. I do also have some other exhibits, but I'm wondering if since we're at
Mhm.
one, we'd want to leave time for questions.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat. Are there land use categories that can be implemented in a way where density is considered category wide, i.e., does the entire category still meet the density range, or are developments always considered separately, i.e., does this development meet density range on its own?
I don't think there's any situation where we'd be able to say, like, based on, a concept plan or a small area plan for an area, we would allow different developments to do a cumulative averaging. Ultimately, every development approved and zoned has to be consistent with the density range established.
Just want to make a quick call for any other questions or
Hi, Angela.
yes. Hey,
This is
Patty.
Patty, and Patty Nauman. Hi, sorry, with Metro Cities, and I apologize. I was double booked a little bit earlier, so I'm actually transitioning between meetings here, and I'm on the phone. But I just want to make a comment here on this particular piece that Metro Cities has been talking with some cities with concerns along this various line, and we are having some continued conversations. I appreciate this presentation today on this front, and we just want to make sure we have mutual understanding, and if there's any room for flexibility along certain lines that we might identify. We just appreciate the council, Angela and her team being open to talking about these issues further as well. Thank you.
Yeah, yes, of course. Um, Agree, Patty and I have been talking about this, and we hope that this is just the foundation laying of a shared understanding of what land use at the council means, how we use it, and what it looks like in some of the requirements for comprehensive planning. But this will be an ongoing conversation. We do hope to pull together a focus group or two throughout the summer, and we'll work with Metro Cities in helping to coordinate those efforts. Any other questions before we conclude? I know we're a minute over.
Apologize for that. I get to talking.
Yeah, I know. It's okay. Okay. We would just like to thank Patty and Anya and your team for hosting the meeting today. We hope it was useful for folks, and we look forward again to the ongoing conversation. Thanks, Mackenzie, for preparing and presenting today as well. Let me know if you have any other questions. Feel free to reach out.